This is probably a suicide.
And where the the gun?
Yeah, there's the entrance.
So then we've got a bullet
In the floor, under him. This gun's gotta be underneath him.
But I still don't see a gun. There's no gun under here.
Something's not right.
There's no way he killed himself if there's no gun.
Well, this just got unexpected.
911, what's the emergency?
My husband has been shot in the head. He's laying in the master bedroom on the floor.
What's your name?
My name's Annie Valgora.
Where is he in the house right now?
Just my son and I.
So do you believe that your son did this?
No. No, my son is 10 years old. It's okay, baby. It's okay. It's all right. Hang on.
I responded urgent status, which means lights and sirens. I was familiar with the house and was one of our former dispatchers at our communication center, but there was a handgun involved. So I asked dispatcher to have the reporting party step out to the front porch, and I wanted to see her hands.
Okay, can you actually step outside, make sure your hands are able to step out to the front porch for the police?
Yeah.
Once I saw her hands, I exited the vehicle. I asked her where her son is. I can see him on the couch. You just stay there with Mama, okay, buddy? When I walk in the doorway to the master bedroom, I can see a body laying on the floor, partially covered with blankets. But I could tell that he was deceased just due to discoloration on his limbs, the lividity, like the blood pooling. What's his name? S-T-V-E-N?
Yes.
Last name?
Olson.
If he's sleeping and someone else shot him, that's a weird position for his arm to be in.
He was located on the ground with his head laying on a body pillow, shot in the head. He was laying down in a face-down posture. His right arm was kinked up in a chicken wing fashion, his palm facing straight up.
There was brain matter that was outside of his head. He wasn't moving. He was cold, kind of stiffening up to the touch.
We treat every death as a suspicious death until proven otherwise. So with this case, it's either suicide or murder.
His name's Steven Olson. That's all I know. And I mean, he's got a flashlight.
He got a knife on his boot. Is that a holster?
Yeah, I'll bet you're right.
Okay.
The holster's empty.
This is weird.
The holster wasn't like a duty holster like I'm wearing, but he's wearing a brand of pant that are very common among law enforcement.
Is he a cop?
And so that made all of us think, okay, well, is he a police officer or what's he doing? And so as I'm looking at the body, and I'm assuming that this is a suicide, he put the gun to his head, and I'm assuming that the gun then fell and his body fell over the top of it. You want to roll?
Yeah.
It does be the entry.
That looks like the exit to me.
Hold on, there's a hole right there.
Oh, you know what? That
Where's there a
pillow was
hole?
over his head.
Oh.
Yep. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, there's the entrance.
Oh, yep.
There was a large opening on the backside of the pillow. When you move the backside of the pillow down, there was blood spattering on a much smaller hole. I think in this particular situation, the pillow was wrapped up over his head and used for sound suppression.
So then we've got a bullet somewhere.
In the floor. Under him.
If he was laying on the floor when he did it.
And where the gun?
This gun's gotta be underneath him.
There's a shell casing.
Yep.
There was a shell casing found near Steve Olson with a stamp on it for a FC-32 auto. It's difficult to make any conclusions based on the placement of any shell casings. We needed the firearm.
I still don't see a gun. There's no gun under here. Well, if there's no gun, then it's not.
That moment, there's an exclamation point that goes off in my head. Oh, all right, well, this is a problem. We need to find the gun to fill in the blanks and help us understand what happened there.
What do we have on tabletops? Anything interesting?
No, I didn't see If there was, I mean, nothing on the nightstand, so. Bathroom over here. Do we know where the gun is?
Nope. I might as
Did
well
she
wait for
cover him
pictures.
with the towel?
I'll ask her if she covered him with a blanket. Did you find him with the blanket on him, or did you put the blanket on him?
I'm sorry.
Was the blanket on him, or did you put it there?
The blanket was...
Okay. Can we put the dogs in the basement?
The house was chaotic, and the dogs are barking so loudly, and Anne was calm. Like, if I had just found a loved one shot in my bedroom, I would be hysterical.
You last saw it
About 1-ish, I went to bed. We were watching a movie. And...
I didn't hear anything through the night.
How old are you now?
I'm 10.
10?
I didn't hear anything through the night until Mom woke me up.
Okay.
I didn't hear anything, but I take all my meds at night.
Were you sleeping in there?
I was sleeping right next to it in my bed.
In your bed?
Yeah. Then again, I don't hold.
So all three of you slept in that room last night?
Yeah. Okay. We were having movie night. But we crashed out before he did.
Okay. Well, just sit tight here. She's saying that all three of them slept in this room last night.
So she woke up and what?
You don't just walk by that.
No. Well, has she moved anything?
No.
Because the blanket was covering him.
We still don't have a gun?
You want to come get some pictures? Okay. Yeah. We might want to close that door. We don't want her to see this.
I don't want her son to see it either.
No.
She's saying that they all they were having a movie night, they were all cuddled in here, in this room, they fell asleep before he did, but she's, I take lots of meds, so I didn't hear anything. But there's no way he killed himself if there's no gun.
I think she shot him.
I don't know. I think she hid the gun somewhere. Well, this just got unexpected.
There was no gun located within reach. Either he died by suicide and somebody moved the gun, or somebody shot him.
Speaking with Anne was a high priority. She's going to be the best one to tell us what actually did happen there.
Nice lady picked up the phone within the first ring.
We found out that Steve Olson had some involvement with law enforcement down in Des Moines, and he was a security guard up at Nebraska Medical Center. He worked double shifts in order to provide extra financial support to the family.
This officer came down and she told me that Steve was gone. My first thought was, I want him back. I want him back. I want my Steve. And it was hard to accept that he's gone. Steve grew up on the farm, and he graduated from high school and enlisted in the Army. He was a helicopter crew chief. A lot of his co-workers spoke about Steve and how friendly he was and how helpful he was, how courageous he was. And that reminds me every day of who he was and what he did.
Initially, when I approached Ann Balgora, we treat her as the reporting party. At the same time of being a reporting party, yes, she's also a potentially grieving widow that just lost her husband. And so there's a lot of delicate questions that are asked in order to, figure out as far as what had happened or what was going on.
This is definitely not the process right now, for any, right? As far as history with Stephen, had he made any comments about self-harm or wanting to hurt himself?
No, we were just trying to put things back together, deciding whether he was going to keep his lease at his apartment or because he was here most of the time anyway. We had separated just because his drinking, he drank heavily. And I said, look, if you're going to have a drink, I get it. And I said, but You can't drink to intoxication every time.
Were you guys ever involved in any sort of physical altercation?
No.
Did he ever threaten violence, anything like that?
No, not towards himself.
What about just fights in general?
We argued about about how much money he spent on alcohol, considering there's other things, and that ties into the loony bit about the whole thing.
The loony bit? He would accuse you of being loony? Or...
Oh, no. I don't think he accused me of being loony. I mean, he knew I was a nut, but I'm a night. It's not that I'm a nut. I'm a night shifter.
Oh, okay.
And I did have acute anxiety. Yes, last year they were telling me I was absolutely loony, that I was, and the bottom line was, I have anxiety, acute anxiety disorder.
Anne was very willing to offer up a bunch of information about her ailments and numerous other things, but not necessarily any grief that took place in regards to Steve dying in the room that we were sitting next to. Obviously, we became more and more suspicious in regards to what had actually occurred in the bedroom.
You have 3 people in a room, 2 people walk out. So there is that external possibility that there was an intruder that came into the home. And then the only other possibility that Anne was responsible for it.
Okay, so you guys were watching the movie last night, and you said you crashed out during that.
Mm-hmm.
And then what was Stephen at
Steve was, he probably laid down to go to bed, I would imagine, at some point. I came out this morning and found the front door open and the screen door, and the alarm was not set.
And then about what time did you wake up?
About 2:15.
About 2:15 today?
Yeah.
Or 2:15 this afternoon, or 2:15?
2:15 today, this afternoon.
Okay.
I didn't know whether Steve had work at 3:30 or 4. And that's when I found the disaster.
So he was laying on the floor in the dark when you woke up?
Yes.
Any other incidents between you and Steve and between Steve and anyone else?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
I can't. I'm just.
Do you have any beliefs?
I'm sorry. I just can't even think straight right now.
She did not provide any names in regards to, I think Steve had a grief with this person, and I think you guys might want to go look at them right away. I found that extremely odd. The fact that she was not willing to come up with any sort of theory is obviously suspicious.
So you have the alarm system. Do you have any, like I have a Ring doorbell that takes video and stuff. Do you guys have anything like that?
So we put like a little one at the top of the steps.
Okay.
And so, I mean, it's just kind of an indoor camera, but...
Okay.
But I don't know if he had it on or not.
Oh, okay. When you found him today, was there a gun laying near him?
I didn't see it. I immediately looked over at my I was like...
Would you have grabbed the gun and thrown it in a drawer so that he wouldn't see it?
No.
Okay.
I didn't even see the gun. I saw the head.
Right.
I was like, I threw the blanket over and I went over. I'm like, come on, buddy, we gotta come out of here. And he goes, what's wrong with Steve? And I said, well, there's something. I said, but you don't want to see this.
Mm-hmm.
I said, you don't need to see this.
And that was smart thinking.
Dispatcher for 10 years.
My police brain is just trying to fill in the blanks and come up with a story that makes sense. If he did it himself, since the gun is not underneath him, then Anne must have moved the gun somewhere. And there's probably a motivation for that. She's trying to protect her son from the gun, or that she hid the gun because she's afraid that if this is a suicide, that life insurance may not pay out.
I think your mom just arrived.
We were trying to get the son interviewed by a juvenile forensic interviewer. It's tragic for someone who's at such a young age to be able to now have to process that and compartmentalize that for the rest of his life.
Would it be able going in there with someone to get some clothes out of the closet for him to put on.
I'll go in with Sergeant McLean and we'll see if we can find those for you.
Okay.
Just so that we can at least get that done.
Okay.
Okay.
And they have all their mirrors covered. What's the deal? Yeah, that's crazy.
Steven's sweatpants and have her like freak out.
Yeah. She seems remarkably unfreaked out.
Wait to shoot.
Well, we're going to work through it a little bit at a time.
Maybe we can head on to the police department and we can continue our conversation. We're going to have the Douglas County Crime Labs going to come in on standard procedure. They come in and process the scene to make sure that we don't miss anything and that we get a full grasp as far as what's everything that's going on. Okay?
The Douglas County Crime Lab was also responding to the scene in order to search the rest of the house. There wasn't necessarily anything that we had concrete at that time. And so we're hoping to preserve any evidence that may be at the scene and at least collect a gunshot residue kit on hand.
Do the same thing with your left palm. Yeah.
Can I have one last cigarette before we go to the police department?
Can I smoke out here? Thank you.
Yep, and we'll see you in a little bit, okay?
Okay.
Just gonna have a cigarette quick.
Okay.
Sorry, I have a ton of stuff in here, so obviously I'm not gonna like handcuff you, but I will have you sit in back.
Okay.
And we're about the only people that fit comfortably. Little short girls.
Oh my god. No kidding. Okay.
When we arrived at the police department, I viewed Ann in a different light from when we initially responded to the call. Now she's a possible suspect. I thought I had a chance to, confront her with a much harder accusation.
There you go.
In order to elicit a response from that.
I just want to make you aware it's a voluntary interview. You don't have to answer any questions I have. You're free to leave at any point in time, okay?
Okay.
So with these general investigations, we go through a standard set of questions that we ask everybody. So the first question we always ask is, did you have any part in any involvement in Stephen's death?
Steve was very protective. Sorry. All through grade school up to high school, if he found out somebody was picking on me on the bus or anywhere, he was there, just leave her alone. It's my sister. He was there, always, just, he was a great brother.
I didn't do anything.
Okay. What occurred last night?
Yesterday, he worked evening shift. My son likes to wait up for Steve so we can have movie time and whatnot. And we were sitting in there and we were almost done watching. The next moment, I'm just dead to the world.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm taking medication at night. Because I don't sleep well. That's why I've got to make sure everything is done in the house before I take my meds.
There's definitely an example of her taking one question and turning it into 3 or 4 different answers. I could see it as an attempt in order to list out the laundry list of everything else that's going on in order to avoid the actual investigation.
So I've got quite a few medical issues.
So where was your son sitting during these movies?
Next to me, most of the time, but I'm sure I fell asleep before he did. Because when I woke up, he was kind of snuggled in my arm. I was like, oh, okay. Really, I gotta get up. I was gonna look at the calendar and see what time I needed to wake Steve up. I'm like, honey, are you in there?
Mm-hmm.
And moved the pillow
the blue and white pillow was like folded over his head, which was, it would never be like that. I'd never seen it like that way before. So I kind of flipped it back and gave him room, and of course let out this gush of and that's when I called, and I'm like, I called Mom. I said, start down this way. I need you down here right away. I said, I'm calling the police right now. I said, apparently something happened last night. Steve's been shot in the head.
She called her mom first. With her history of being a dispatcher, also an EMT, that struck us as very unique, very odd, very inconsistent with what most people would do if they just found their spouse, dead on the floor in front of their bed.
I said, I felt her carotid, got no pulse. I said, it appears that rigor is setting in. And I said, I said, at this point, I said, Mom, he's gone. I said, there's no way. And she goes, okay, let me grab your sister, and we'll head that way. And at that point, I hung up with them, and I called 911.
Do you mind if I look at your phone just to see what the time frame was on that call?
Absolutely. Oh, here. And obviously, you can see I'm not a loon. I'm upset. And I'm sorry if I'm scattering a little. I'm a little... I think I'm just a little in shock. Ugh. I don't get it. I don't understand.
Tell me more about the rigor.
Rigor?
Yeah, as far as what you observed that led you to believe that.
I'm an EMT, but rigor, when it gets hard. Mm-hmm. When the body gets hard and stiff.
Yeah, I know what it is, but what did you observe on him that you observed as rigor?
So I tried to move him, and, I, of course, touched his neck. There's nothing there. And I'm trying to see if there's anything. And he was just stiff. And, and hate to put it in ambulance code, but, DOA, but he was.
I've never heard anyone discuss a loved one's state of rigor when they've been found deceased. So the fact that she was using those terms to describe her husband is rather bizarre.
This situation, we have to kind of decipher on the spot. Is she trying to process? Is she trying to compartmentalize right now? Or is she just straight out lying to us?
Do you and Stephen have any disputes?
We had problems, and we were doing so well with our problems. Mm-hmm. Our finances are a little bit foobarred right now. That's because I'm not working, obviously, and he is, he's the only income. He's got 2 places he's paying for, basically. And I don't even know. I know he's got an insurance policy somewhere, but I'd have to dig it up and dig it out and find out what it is. I don't know what it is, and I don't know who it's with.
She volunteers that there was a life insurance policy, and so you kind of start piecing together, okay, if she was got a financial benefit, that pointed the finger more towards Anne, that she was involved in it.
It was a leap forward in that process, down that path that established that Anne might have shot and killed Steve Olson.
I want to go ahead and backtrack as far as what occurred here. And how did you find the doors when you exited the room this morning, or this afternoon, I should say?
I came out and the alarm was not on. I thought, well, that's odd, and noticed that the front door was open like that far, about an inch. And the clicker for the screen on the door was open, in the open position. I wouldn't leave my house like that.
The clicker was open?
The screen lock.
Oh, okay. So for the storm door?
Yeah.
Out front?
Yeah. It was unlocked as well.
Outside of Anne's statements of the door was found open when she woke up in the morning and the storm door was unlocked, there was no indication in the house that somebody had entered the house or got involved in any sort of struggle. It becomes more and more likely that Anne was essentially covering up any involvement in it.
What happened after that?
So then I go in and I'm like, okay, it's time for you guys to get up. I walked over and I'm like, hey, loser. You're not supposed to sleep on the floor. Get up. And I said, it's almost 2:30 and I don't know when you work, so you need to get up.
Anne's behavior was just so odd. You kind of go, okay, is this somebody whose behavior and their speech and the manner that they're presenting themselves consistent with someone who just came upon their husband shot in the head?
And there was just no response at all. I just freaked out. And I couldn't go back in and look myself even. I didn't want to.
As far as he had a holster that was on him, does he normally always carry a gun? Did he have a gun on him last night?
He has a gun. Yeah, he usually carries.
Where would he have stored the gun? Where does he typically store the gun when he sleeps?
At night?
Fast? Yeah.
He sleeps with it. It could be here, it could be there, it could be in his holster. I've seen him sleep with it laying right next to his hand. I've seen him laying on top of it. There's a smaller one that he leaves at home. It's a little Beretta. It's his. That's for in case of emergencies. And I have none. You want me to shoot an intruder if there's ever an intruder. But I said, I've taken that oath to heal. I said, I'm an EMT. I'm an EMT instructor. I said, I don't really want one. And I said, if you want to leave one up there, that's fine. Or leave it in the case or whatever. Make sure it's got a gun lock on it. I said, I don't care. It's nice to know that there's a weapon there that if any harm was to come to the child. But I told him I can't. I said I couldn't do that.
What else do you know about his other guns?
That's really all I know about his gun stuff. Because I don't like them. I've seen what they can do. So I'm really kind of an anti-gun person.
As far as her never being able to shoot an intruder, not having much contact with guns in the house, that clearly shows that she just wanted to really kind of distance herself from it. There's enough oddities in the conversation that we had already had that anything that Anne had told me during that interview, I would have been extremely skeptical of.
And what do you think happened to the handgun?
I have no idea. I have no idea from the time I fell asleep to the time I got up and started running around and doing my thing that anything had happened. So it's kind of, I don't know what else to tell you.
Okay.
I mean, I just don't, because, like I said, I take these meds.
Did you know of anybody that he was having disputes with? Anything along those lines?
He had disputes on a daily basis when he worked in the yard and stuff like that with people.
Anything that would have followed him home, no?
A couple. There were a few, especially with one particular one. You know, he says, I'll find where you live and I'll kill your family. First I'll kill your family and then I'll make it, and then I'll kill you. But you're no longer. He had recent altercations that made threats. And so it's kind of one of those things of, I said, is there going to be a problem? But obviously that didn't take place. So I don't know. May he have made some friends or acquaintances? I would assume so. I have heard stories of
anybody he was in a business deal with, anything along those lines?
Not that I'm aware of.
We're going down the road of looking at a possible suspect. But there was nobody she suspected that broke into her house. There was just very little information that was offered up through that. I felt that we were going around in circles.
Would there be any reason why gunshot residue would show up on your hand?
No, unless it comes off on like the pillow or blanket that I lifted up or checked him for vitals.
Mm-hmm.
That would be the only reason.
Okay.
I don't know how that's transferred exactly, so I don't know if that counts or not.
Okay. I do have our forensic or computer forensics guy coming down.
Mm-hmm.
Would you consent for us doing an extraction on your cell phone? Just extraction, just look through it, make sure that everything matches up, see if there's any clues on that.
Oh, I don't care.
Okay.
Have it.
Okay.
It's a piece of crap.
Let me go and fill out that form
Okay.
so that we can get started on that, and then I'll be back in to check on you, okay?
She was not in custody at the time. And we had kind of reached a point where it was now important for us to, find out what her son said during his interview, and then also find out what exists in the form of physical evidence at the home. We contacted ADT, which was the security company that operated the security system within Ann Belgora's home. Anytime that front door was opened even an inch, the chimes for the doors announcing someone's arrival would have gone off, and also logged their entrance onto the security system logs. The security system had showed that the front door was closed all night and was not open until Ann reported that she had woke the next day, which was contradictory to her statement that the door was open when she first awoke. It also showed that the security system had lost connectivity via the internet that had supported it for communication. But even if she were to unplug the internet to disable the security system, it's still going to communicate with ADT via cell signal.
Also, Ann told us there was a motion camera that was sitting up in the hallway of the second floor of the residence. It was an infrared camera that was motion activated. We were able to forensically examine that camera.
Later on that night, Steve is seen upstairs along with Ann's child. Appears to be checking the upstairs, and they walk through. At that point in time, Steve has a large handgun that's on his hip. Also, the camera scans across and shows a laundry pile that's located at the end of the hallway in front of the linen closet.
Hours later, when it activated itself again, based on motion, it showed that Andy walked through the camera nude from the waist up, and we were able to discern that the laundry on the south end of the hallway had been moved and displaced.
Ann claimed that she had taken her nightly medication and that when she takes that, she's dead to the world, and she was sound asleep. She didn't hear anything. So that there's camera footage and with Ann moving about through the upstairs indicates that wasn't true.
We were starting to dig through every single room upstairs. We were looking for any weapon that was capable of firing a .32 and every aspect of where we believe a gun could fit. And then in the laundry room, we were able to locate a .32 caliber Beretta upside down in the dryer. The same markings that were on the shell casings that were in the magazine of that Beretta was consistent to this casing that had already been fired. As soon as we found it, we deemed it this is the murder weapon. Finding the gun was a turning point. I believe that Ann took that upstairs after she took her clothes off because she was washing her clothes. I think that she washed the gun as well. Later in that day, we were able to find a Colt 45 in the upstairs laundry pile.
Comparison of that Colt 45 Commander along with the video of Steve upstairs at 1:30 a.m. It appears to be the handgun that he had on his hip when he was walking around the house at night.
I believe that she took that weapon off of him and then hid it, just possibly to throw us off.
Those interviewers are trained to make sure that they're not leading that child witness to an answer and really give them an opportunity to tell their side of the story and what they heard.
Ann Sun stated the night before, while Steve had fallen asleep, the gun that was located on Steve's hip had fallen out and onto the floor. At about 4 a.m., and that's when he had said that everything had gotten really weird.
He said Stephen is kind of asleep on the floor at some point and snoring. And then her son reports that he heard a thud, kind of what he calls a silent gunshot.
And his mom told him that was nothing and he should go back to bed.
He also observed that Steve had stopped snoring. Based on everything that's happened up to this point, we came to the conclusion that Ann Valgora got up in the middle of the night, took a firearm out, went to the end of the bed, and killed Steve Olson.
The way everything appeared in the house. And then if you add that to the things that Ann's son said during his interview, at that point, I think law enforcement felt pretty confident that they had their suspect.
Ann had gone to her mother's house to stay for the evening. And so we had went out to the residence in order to make contact with her, informing her that, we needed to talk to her back at the police department to finish up some stuff.
Camera's already on and roll.
Okay. No. Just
we'll go over to this side, Ann. And hop in there. Put that seatbelt on for me. That'd be great.
All right. Your passenger seat empty?
Yes. Ready for you.
You didn't happen to pick up my medication, did you?
We did.
Oh, thank God. Oh. No, my head is pounding.
Ann seemed nonchalant, not necessarily worried, not asking questions, not saying, hey, did you get more information? Did you find out who did it? So how long have you raised the Burmese mountain dogs?
Oh, God. This is my second set that I've retired. So, I want to say that 10 years.
We ended up having a 20-minute conversation about the Burmese mountain dogs that she was breeding in her home. And I definitely felt that she was avoiding anything that had to do with the case or what we were looking to discuss once we were back down at the police department.
If you want to have a seat in there again for me, can I get you a water or anything? You got that? Okay. Give me a bit and I'll be right in.
Okay.
This interview would include much more directed questions. We just need to understand the why and give her an opportunity to explain what caused her to do anything.
Okay. So obviously we went out to the house and we did a search warrant. I definitely think we have a better idea or a better picture as far as what happened.
Okay.
So after seeing everything, I'm just going to tell you, we found that you were responsible for Stephen's death.
Okay. I'd like an attorney.
Okay. You want to stand up?
How could I'm just asking, in what way would I be responsible for it?
Well, we can't. We can't have a further discussion with you if you've invoked your right and you'd like to speak with an attorney. So,
okay.
Stops our interview, Ann.
Okay.
When anyone requests a lawyer when you're in that situation, you take it as a hit. But that evening, Ann was booked for second-degree murder and then lodged at the Sarpy County Jail.
A Papillion woman is in jail this evening, charged with murder.
And police just released the first details in the case this afternoon, and Sharon Chen is on the live desk with more.
Well, John and Lauren, we've learned that it was about 3:30 yesterday when Papillion police officers found Stephen Douglas Olson with a gunshot wound to the head. Officers arrested 49-year-old Anne Valgora. She is accused of second-degree murder with the use of a deadly weapon to commit a felony and also tampering with evidence. Valgora is set to appear before a judge tomorrow morning.
There was a jail call that she had made to a family member explaining that there was a life insurance policy on Steve, contrary to what she had explained to us in her interview.
You need to call his insurance company. It's going to be like New York Life. It's going to be one of those black tubs. And I don't know how that'll work and I would just say, look, he's passed away. She's in jail right now. And it will go to me directly as wife.
The life insurance policy was located in the black tote within the bedroom.
And what was discovered is that Stephen's life insurance policy had Anne as the 100% beneficiary of that. Also, in text messages, she was kind of pressing Stephen to make sure that payments were made on his premium for that life insurance policy. Their finances were in a bad place. Their relationship in general just seemed to be so volatile. I don't know that the life insurance was the sole reason, but it does appear that it might have motivated her as well. She ultimately pled to first-degree assault, which sounds like a huge step down from first-degree murder. But in Nebraska, the potential sentence for first-degree assault is 50 years. So we knew that if she was willing to plead guilty to that, at her age, she'd be serving some pretty significant jail time. She was sentenced to 40 to 50 years in jail.
Obviously, it's important to seek justice for Steve Olson because at some level, he trusted Ann. And at some point in his life, he loved Ann enough that they got married. And she betrayed that trust in the most egregious way that someone can do that.
Steve was always so good. When I'd talk to him on the phone and I'd call him and talk to him for a while, and when we'd say goodbye, he'd always say, "Love you," you know.
It's been hard, but I still talk to Steve. That's a lot of his friends and coworkers and everybody. They're like, talk to him. He's still there. He's listening.
"20 years can erase a face. It can erase a voice. It can turn a photograph into a faded rectangle in an old evidence box. But sometimes, 20 years cannot erase a fingerprint. Sometimes, the smallest thing left behind is the one thing that refuses to die. A paper bag, a few creases, a fingerprint no one noticed when the case was still young. And somewhere inside that print was the possibility that the person who had vanished into ordinary life had never really escaped. In 1999, the disappearance began like hundreds of other missing person cases. A quiet community, an ordinary day, a person who was expected to come home. Then the hours passed. The phone stopped ringing. Doors remained unanswered. A family began calling friends. Friends began calling hospitals. And eventually, someone called the police. At first, there was no reason to believe the case would become one of those investigations that followed detectives for decades. There was no dramatic crime scene waiting behind yellow tape. No confession. No obvious suspect standing beneath a streetlight. There was only absence. That was the first problem. Absence leaves almost nothing behind. Investigators began with the most basic questions. Where had the victim last been seen? Who had spoken to her? What vehicle had been nearby? Which roads could have been used? Who knew her routine? Who knew where she lived? Who knew when she would be alone? The answers were frustratingly ordinary. And ordinary is dangerous in an investigation. Because extraordinary crimes often begin inside ordinary minutes. The first officers moved through the area looking for anything that seemed out of place. A discarded object, a footprint, a vehicle description, a witness who remembered hearing an argument, a neighbor who had looked through a window at exactly the right moment. Nothing. Then came the first break. A witness remembered something that initially seemed insignificant. A vehicle had been seen nearby. The description was vague. The memory was worse. Color, shape, maybe an older model, maybe dark, maybe not. The witness could not provide a plate number. It was the kind of information that could disappear inside a case file. But investigators kept it. They began building a timeline. That timeline became the spine of the investigation. Minute by minute. Location by location. Name by name. And slowly, a disturbing possibility emerged. The victim may not have disappeared voluntarily. The case was no longer simply a missing person investigation. It had become something darker. A kidnapping. And if that was true, then someone had taken control of another human being and moved her against her will. The question was simple. Who? Detectives began interviewing everyone connected to the victim. Friends, acquaintances, people from work, people who had crossed paths with her, people who said they barely knew her, people who said they knew her very well. Every interview created another version of the same world. One person described the victim as cautious. Another remembered her as trusting. Someone mentioned a recent disagreement. Someone else said there had been nothing unusual. The investigators learned quickly that memory was not a recording. It was a battlefield. People remembered what they thought mattered. They forgot what seemed ordinary. And 24 hours after a disappearance, the ordinary became critical. A conversation that had seemed meaningless suddenly became important. A vehicle parked for 5 minutes became suspicious. A phone call became a potential clue. A person who had once been invisible suddenly became part of the investigation. Detectives began checking alibis. Some were solid. Some were weak. Some depended entirely on another person's memory. And one name began appearing more frequently than the others. Not because investigators had proof, because the timeline kept bending toward him. He was not immediately arrested. There was not enough. There was no physical evidence tying him directly to the disappearance. No eyewitness who could place him with certainty. No confession. No weapon. No body. Only questions. And questions do not survive well in court. They survive in police notebooks. They survive in cold cases. They survive in the minds of detectives who cannot sleep because one missing piece refuses to appear. The investigation expanded. Detectives searched locations connected to the disappearance. They examined vehicles. They reviewed statements. They returned to the original scene. They looked again at objects that had already been photographed. The first search produced little. The second produced less. The third produced something that looked like nothing. A paper bag. It had been preserved. At the time, it did not seem important enough to transform the case. It was simply another object. Something that might have been touched by anyone. Something that might have been contaminated by dozens of people. Something that could have belonged to the victim. Or the person who took her. Or no one involved at all. The bag went into evidence. Then the case began to cool. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The initial urgency faded. The detectives who had worked the case were assigned elsewhere. Witnesses moved. Memories changed. Leads disappeared. Records became harder to locate. The case did not end. It simply stopped moving. For the family, however, there was no stopping. Every telephone call could still mean something. Every knock at the door could still carry hope. Every unidentified body reported in another county could trigger the same terrible question. Could it be her? The years passed. The file became older. The photographs faded. The names remained. And somewhere in an evidence room, the paper bag waited. No one knew that it was waiting for technology to catch up with the crime. No one knew that a fingerprint too faint to matter in 1999 might become decisive 20 years later. No one knew that the smallest detail in the case might eventually become the loudest. But cold cases have a strange way of preserving possibilities. The killer may forget. The victim's family may be forced to live with uncertainty. The community may move on. But evidence does not care about time. Evidence waits. And sometimes, 20 years later, it speaks. The case did not die on the day the investigation slowed down. It died differently. It died in small pieces. One unanswered telephone call. One witness who stopped returning messages. One lead that went nowhere. One detective transferred to another assignment. One evidence box moved from an active shelf to a storage room. That was how cold cases were born. Not with a decision to stop looking, but with the slow disappearance of urgency. And yet, there was one thing investigators refused to accept. The timeline still did not make sense. The last confirmed movements of the victim created a narrow window, a short period of time in which something had happened. A person had approached her. A vehicle had potentially been involved. And then she was gone. That window became an obsession. Detectives reconstructed it again and again. They drew maps. They marked intersections. They estimated travel times. They calculated how long it would take to drive from one location to another under normal conditions. Then they calculated it again. And again. Because somewhere inside those minutes was the answer. The problem was that the investigation had been built around imperfect memories. People remembered what they believed they had seen, not necessarily what had actually happened. One witness insisted a vehicle had been parked nearby during the relevant period. Another remembered seeing movement inside it. A third person said nothing unusual had occurred at all. 3 memories. 3 versions. 1 disappearance. Investigators knew at least one of those memories had to be wrong. But which one? They returned to the original interviews. The tapes were old. Some recordings were incomplete. Some statements existed only as handwritten notes. Investigators who had conducted the first interviews had since moved on. Some had retired. Others could barely remember the case. The new detectives had to become archaeologists. They dug through the past. They searched storage cabinets. They examined old reports. They compared handwritten notes with typed summaries. They looked for inconsistencies. And inconsistencies began appearing everywhere. A time that had been recorded as 1 hour in one report appeared differently in another. A witness described a vehicle as dark in one interview, then lighter in a later conversation. A person who initially claimed not to know the victim later admitted they had spoken several times. None of these things proved a crime. But together they created pressure. Something had been missed. The investigators could feel it. They just could not see it. The suspect who had attracted attention years earlier was still somewhere in the background. He had lived his life. That was perhaps the most disturbing part. While the family waited for answers, he had continued moving through the world. He worked. He spoke to people. He bought groceries. He paid bills. He slept at night. Or at least, that was what everyone assumed. There was no arrest. No courtroom. No dramatic confrontation. Only suspicion. And suspicion has a strange relationship with time. The longer it survives without proof, the more dangerous it becomes. It can either disappear completely or become something much harder. A theory. Investigators began examining the suspect's movements around the time of the disappearance. Who had seen him? Where had he been? What had he driven? What had he purchased? Who could confirm his story? The answers were not clean. But they were not enough. Again, the same wall. No physical evidence. No direct witness. No confession. The case remained trapped between possibility and proof. Then, during a renewed review of the evidence, investigators found the paper bag. It was not new. It had been there since the beginning. The evidence label had survived. The bag itself had survived. What had changed was technology. For years, latent fingerprints had been limited by the quality of the print and the ability of investigators to compare it. A partial print might be photographed. It might be lifted. It might be preserved. But if there was no known suspect against whom to compare it, the print could remain meaningless. A fingerprint without a name was only a pattern, a collection of ridges, a tiny biological signature with nowhere to go. Modern forensic databases changed that equation. Now, a fingerprint could potentially be searched against records that did not exist when the crime occurred. Investigators began asking a different question. Not, whose fingerprint is this? But, can technology tell us? The paper bag was examined again. Under controlled conditions, forensic technicians carefully inspected its surface. The object had survived years in storage, but evidence does not age in the same way people do. The paper had changed. The print had weakened, but it had not disappeared. There, near one of the folded edges, a pattern. Faint. Fragmented. Almost invisible. The technician stopped. The room became quiet. A fingerprint. Not perfect. Not complete. But potentially usable. Photographs were taken. Measurements were made. The ridge patterns were analyzed. Investigators did not immediately celebrate. Experienced detectives knew better. A partial fingerprint could create false confidence. A match required careful examination, independent verification, a defensible chain of evidence. The forensic team began the process, ridge by ridge, minutiae by minutiae. The print contained several identifiable characteristics, enough to raise interest, not enough to announce a conclusion. The technician compared it against available records. Nothing. The print was run again. Still nothing. The problem was obvious. The person who left the print might never have been fingerprinted, or the relevant records might not have existed in the searchable system. The clue was real. The answer was not. But now the investigation had something it had not possessed for years. A physical connection. Someone had touched that bag. Someone's hand had been there. And if the bag was connected to the crime, then the person who touched it might have been connected too. The detectives returned to the evidence history. Where had the bag been found? Who had handled it? When had it been collected? Had it been inside the original crime scene? Had it been recovered nearby? Could it have been contaminated after the disappearance? Every question mattered, because a fingerprint only has meaning when context gives it meaning. A print on a public object could belong to anyone. A print on an object connected directly to the victim was different. The investigators reviewed the original photographs. They enlarged them. They studied the background. They searched for the bag. Then they found something. The bag appeared in an old photograph from the investigation. It had been lying near material considered relevant to the disappearance. The photograph was grainy. The image quality was poor, but the object was identifiable. That changed the case. The paper bag was not merely an item recovered years ago. It had been present during the original investigation. Now the question became unavoidable. Why had someone touched it? And when? The detectives began constructing another timeline. This time, they were not tracking a person. They were tracking an object. Where had the bag been? Who could have touched it legitimately? Who could have handled it during evidence collection? Who had access before it was sealed? The possibility of contamination had to be considered. That meant every fingerprint on the bag could not simply be treated as evidence of guilt. One of the most dangerous mistakes in forensic investigation is assuming that finding a person's fingerprint proves involvement in a crime. It does not. A fingerprint proves contact. Context must establish significance. The detectives understood that. So they made a list. Every investigator who might have touched the bag, every technician, every person who had legitimate access, every possible source of contamination. The list grew. Then came the harder question. What if the fingerprint belonged to none of them? The forensic team began eliminating known handlers, one by one. The process was slow, painfully slow. Old records had to be located. Retired personnel had to be contacted. Reference fingerprints had to be obtained where possible. Some people could not be reached. Some had died. Some records were incomplete. The investigation was becoming a puzzle where pieces had been scattered across 2 decades. And then one comparison came back negative. Then another. Then another. The print did not belong to several known handlers. The possibility that it had been left before evidence collection grew stronger. The detectives looked again at the suspect list. There he was. The same name. The same unanswered questions. The same timeline. But there was a problem. He had never been convicted of anything that would necessarily place his fingerprints in the system. Investigators needed a lawful way to compare the print. They needed something more than intuition. They needed a reference sample. That was when surveillance began. Not the dramatic kind shown in movies. No high-speed chase. No flashing lights. Just patient observation. Where did he go? Who did he meet? What was his routine? Did he still use the same vehicle? Had he moved? Had his appearance changed? Had his life become so ordinary that no one would ever imagine he had once been connected to an unsolved disappearance? The detectives watched and waited. They were looking for an opportunity to obtain evidence without alerting him. Because if the fingerprint eventually proved significant, one mistake could destroy the entire case. A discarded object. A cup. A bottle. A piece of paper. Anything he had touched. Investigators needed a clean reference sample. Then one evening, the opportunity appeared. The suspect stopped somewhere ordinary. Nothing about the moment looked important. That was what made it valuable. He left behind an object he had handled. Investigators recovered it according to procedure. The reference material was sent for examination. Now the case had reached a point nobody could have predicted 20 years earlier. A fingerprint recovered from an old paper bag. A modern forensic examination. A suspected individual. And a reference sample. The comparison began. The technician did not rush. The old print was placed beside the new reference. The rich formations were enlarged. Patterns appeared. The examiner studied the first characteristic. Then another. Then another. There was no sound in the laboratory except the quiet movement of equipment and the occasional click of a keyboard. The technician continued. At first, it looked promising. Then the comparison became stronger. A ridge ending. A bifurcation. Another distinctive feature. The probability of coincidence began shrinking. But the examiner still did not speak. Because forensic science demands patience. The question was no longer whether the suspect could have touched the bag. The question was whether the print actually belonged to him. The comparison continued late into the evening. 2 decades of uncertainty had been reduced to a few inches of ridge detail. And somewhere inside that tiny pattern was the possibility of a name. The possibility of an answer. The possibility that the man who had spent 20 years living beyond the reach of the original investigation had unknowingly left behind the one thing he could never explain away. His fingerprint. The technician looked at the final comparison, then looked again. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the examiner reached for the phone. Because after 20 years, the cold case had finally produced something investigators had been missing from the beginning. Not a rumor. Not a theory. Not another witness with a fading memory. A physical connection. And now, for the first time, the question was no longer, who could have done it? It was something much more dangerous. Why was his fingerprint there? The phone call lasted less than a minute. The information inside it could change everything. The fingerprint recovered from the paper bag was consistent with the reference sample taken from the man investigators had been watching. But consistent was not the same as guilty. That distinction mattered. It mattered more than ever. A cold case could survive suspicion. It could survive theories. It could survive 20 years of unanswered questions. But a courtroom demanded something different. Proof. The detectives did not rush to the suspect's house. They did not put his name in front of the cameras. They did not tell the family that the case was solved. Instead, they went back to the beginning. They needed to know exactly what the fingerprint meant. The paper bag was brought back into the center of the investigation. Every photograph was reviewed. Every evidence log was examined. Every person who had handled the object was identified, if possible. The chain of custody became critical. If the fingerprint had appeared after the evidence was collected, it could be meaningless. If the bag had been handled by the suspect before the disappearance, it could be devastating. The investigators needed to establish when. That single word became the center of everything. When? When had he touched the bag? When had the bag been near the victim? When had the bag been collected? When had the suspect been near the victim? When had he first entered the investigation? The answers had to intersect. And they had to intersect without forcing them. The detectives began reconstructing the original crime scene from photographs. They enlarged images taken in 1999. The pictures were poor by modern standards. Film grain. Harsh flash. Dark corners. Objects partially obscured. But investigators were not looking for beauty. They were looking for geometry. Distance. Position. Orientation. The paper bag appeared in more than one image. In one photograph it was partly folded. In another it had shifted. That raised a question. Had someone moved it? The evidence technician, who had collected the original items, was contacted. Years had passed. Memory had faded. But the old report remained. The technician remembered collecting several objects from the scene. The bag was among them. It had not been treated as insignificant. It had been preserved because investigators believed it might eventually become relevant. That decision, made almost 2 decades earlier, now looked extraordinary. The detectives asked another question. Had the suspect ever had a legitimate reason to touch that bag? There were possibilities. And every possibility had to be tested. Perhaps he had been there for an innocent reason. Perhaps he had handled something belonging to the victim. Perhaps he had touched the bag before the crime. Perhaps he had touched it afterward. Or perhaps the fingerprint had nothing to do with the disappearance. That last possibility could not be ignored. Investigators began interviewing people again. Not the way they had in 1999. This time, they had 20 years of hindsight. That was both an advantage and a danger. Hindsight could reveal patterns. It could also create them where none existed. Detectives returned to old witnesses and asked the same questions differently. What do you remember about that day? Who was present? Who arrived first? Who left? Was there a vehicle? Did anyone seem nervous? Did anyone behave differently afterward? Some witnesses remembered almost nothing. Others remembered details they had never mentioned before. One former acquaintance suddenly recalled a conversation. It had seemed meaningless at the time. The suspect had allegedly made a strange comment about the disappearance. Not a confession, not even a direct reference. Just a remark that, in isolation, could have meant anything. But now detectives had to decide whether it was coincidence. The interview continued. The witness hesitated, then remembered something else. The suspect had asked whether investigators had found anything. At the time, the question had not seemed unusual. After all, people talked. Rumors spread. Everyone in the community knew someone had disappeared. But the wording mattered. Investigators wrote it down. Then they compared it with the suspect's earlier statements. That comparison produced another inconsistency. Years earlier, he had claimed he had known very little about the case. Now, the witness suggested he had been asking detailed questions. Still not enough, but another crack in the wall. The detectives began examining his movements after the disappearance. This was where the investigation became more difficult. People change. Addresses change. Jobs change. Vehículos desaparecen. Telephone records from the late 1990s are not always easy to recover. Some companies no longer exist. Some records have been destroyed according to retention policies. Some documents exist only on paper. The detectives had to rebuild a life from fragments. They tracked his employment history. They examined old addresses. They located people who had known him at the time. One former colleague remembered that he had appeared unusually distracted around the relevant period. Another remembered nothing unusual. A neighbor remembered seeing him leave at an odd hour. But when questioned closely, the neighbor admitted the memory was uncertain. Again, the same problem. Memory. 20 years had turned eyewitness testimony into something fragile. The detectives needed something stronger. They needed records. Then they found an old document. It contained a date that placed the suspect somewhere he had never mentioned during the original investigation. The difference was not enormous, but it mattered. His original account suggested he had remained in one location. The document suggested he had traveled. Not far, but far enough. Far enough to overlap with the narrow window surrounding the disappearance. The detectives stared at the timeline. For the first time, the fingerprint and the movement history appeared to point in the same direction. But coincidence was still possible. Two independent clues could both be misleading. The investigation needed another layer. Vehicle records. The suspect had owned a vehicle during the relevant period. Investigators tried to determine whether it was the same vehicle described by witnesses. The description had been poor, but old photographs provided something useful. A vehicle registered to the suspect appeared similar to what witnesses remembered. The color was close. The general shape was close. The model was plausible. But plausible was not enough. Investigators needed something more precise. They searched for maintenance records, insurance records, old registration documents, anything that could establish whether the vehicle had been on the road during the critical period. Then another detail emerged. The vehicle had reportedly received maintenance shortly after the disappearance. That was not inherently suspicious. Cars need repairs. But the timing caught attention. The investigators examined the location of the repair shop. It was not far from the area connected to the case. Again, coincidence. Again, a clue that meant nothing by itself. The case was becoming a structure built from small pieces. No single piece was enough. Together, they were beginning to form a shape. The detectives understood the danger. If they convinced themselves too early, they could interpret every new detail as confirmation. That was how wrongful convictions began. So they deliberately looked for evidence that contradicted their theory. They searched for reasons the suspect could not have committed the crime. They searched for witnesses who could place him elsewhere. They reviewed his employment schedule. They examined his known relationships. They looked at travel records. They reconstructed the route between his location and the victim's last known location. And then they found a problem. A significant one. The suspect appeared to have an alibi. Not perfect, but enough to complicate the case. Someone remembered seeing him at another location during part of the critical window. The memory was supported by an old record. If that account was accurate, the suspect could not have been where investigators believed he was. For a moment, the case seemed to collapse. The fingerprint remained. But the timeline did not cooperate. The detective stopped. They went back again. What time had the witness actually seen him? What time had the record been created? What time did the victim disappear? The difference was measured in minutes. Minutes. The same minutes that had haunted the investigation from the beginning. The alibi covered part of the window. Not all of it. And suddenly, the investigators realized what they had been missing. The question was not whether the suspect could have been somewhere else. The question was how long he had been there. They reconstructed his route. If he had left one location at a certain time, he could potentially have reached another location before the victim disappeared. The possibility was narrow, but it existed. And narrow possibilities were enough to keep a cold case alive. The detectives then focused on the paper bag. Why a paper bag? Why had it been preserved? What had been inside? The original report offered only a partial answer. The bag had been associated with items investigators believed might have been connected to the victim. Its exact significance had never been established. That uncertainty now became critical. If the bag had belonged to the victim, the suspect's fingerprint would be extremely difficult to explain. If the bag had belonged to someone else, the meaning could be completely different. The detectives searched for photographs of the victim carrying similar bags. They contacted former acquaintances. They examined shopping records where available. They searched through old photographs. Then they found one. A photograph taken before the disappearance. The victim appeared in the background. Near her was a familiar type of paper bag. The image was not perfect. The bag's markings were difficult to see, but its shape appeared similar. The investigators enlarged it. They compared the folds, the handles, the distinctive crease along one side. The possibility became stronger. The bag could have belonged to the victim. And if it had, the fingerprint suddenly became much more significant. But there was another question. When had the suspect touched it? The detectives returned to the people who had been around the victim before her disappearance. One person remembered seeing the suspect with her. Another denied it. A third person was uncertain. The case was beginning to resemble a locked room. Every door seemed to lead somewhere. Then close examination revealed another detail on the paper bag. Not another fingerprint. Something much smaller. A trace. A fragment. Almost invisible beneath the fold. The laboratory had overlooked it during the original examination because the technology of the time had not allowed investigators to examine such material with the same sensitivity available today. Now, under modern analysis, the fragment became visible. The detectives did not know yet what it was. But they knew one thing. It had survived 20 years. And if it could be identified, it might answer the question the fingerprint could not. Not just who had touched the bag, but what had happened to it. The laboratory began another examination. The sample was tiny. Too tiny for careless handling. The technician prepared the material. Microscopic analysis. Chemical testing. Trace comparison. The process began. The investigators waited. Hours passed. Then the preliminary result arrived. The material appeared consistent with something associated with the environment in which the victim had last been seen. It was not enough for a courtroom, but it was enough for another search. The detectives now had 3 lines of inquiry: the fingerprint, the timeline, the trace material. 3 separate threads. If they converged, the case could change forever. If they did not, investigators would have to accept that the fingerprint might be nothing more than coincidence. The suspect, meanwhile, remained unaware of how close the investigation had come. He had spent 20 years believing the past was buried. The detectives were about to test that belief. They prepared for another interview. This time, they would not begin with the fingerprint. They would not accuse him. They would not reveal everything they knew. They would start with the past. A simple question. Where were you that day? The same question he had answered 20 years earlier. But this time, the detectives had the records. They had the timeline. They had the fingerprint. And they had something else. They knew where his story had changed. The interview room was prepared. The recorder was switched on. The door closed. And when the suspect sat down across from the investigators, he still did not know that the most dangerous evidence in the room was not the fingerprint. It was his own memory. Because after 20 years, investigators were about to ask him to tell the same story again. And this time, they were going to compare every word. The recorder was already running when the suspect entered the room. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting, no accusation. Just a table, 2 chairs, a glass of water, and a small recording device sitting between them. The detectives had learned one lesson from 20 years of failure. People could survive accusations. They could become defensive. They could deny. They could become angry. But memory was different. Memory could betray a person without warning. That was what the investigators were counting on. The suspect sat down. He looked older than he had in the photographs from 1999. Gray at the temples. Lines around the eyes. The face of a man who had lived through 2 decades while an unanswered disappearance remained somewhere behind him. The detective across the table did not mention the paper bag. He did not mention the fingerprint. He did not mention the forensic laboratory. Instead, he began with a simple question. Where were you on the day she disappeared? The suspect answered quickly. He had answered the question before. 20 years earlier. His original statement was pulled from the file and placed beside the new interview notes. The detectives listened. The story sounded familiar, almost identical. He had been somewhere else. He had been occupied. He remembered very little. He had not seen the victim. He had not spoken to her. He had no idea what happened. The detective nodded, then asked another question. What time did you leave? The suspect gave an approximate time. The detective wrote it down. Then came another question. Where did you go afterward? Another answer. Another approximate time. Then another. The detective did not challenge him. Not yet. Instead, the questions became smaller. What road did you take? Where did you stop? Did you buy anything? Did you speak with anyone? Did you use your vehicle? Did anyone see you? The suspect answered. Some answers were confident. Others were vague. The detective allowed the silence to continue after each response. Silence is difficult. People often rush to fill it. Sometimes they add details that were never requested. Sometimes they correct themselves. Sometimes they reveal more than they intended. The suspect began doing exactly that. A detail appeared, then another. The detective returned to the first answer. You said you left at approximately 2. Now you are saying closer to 2:30. Which one is correct? The suspect paused. He had forgotten which version he had given. He corrected himself. 2. Maybe. The detective did not react. He simply wrote it down. The interview continued. For nearly an hour, the investigators asked questions that appeared almost meaningless. What was the weather like? Who were you with? What did you do that morning? What did you eat? Where did you park? Which direction did you travel? The suspect answered. But every answer became another piece of a timeline, and every piece could later be compared against records. That was the strategy. They were not trying to force a confession. They were trying to measure consistency. After years of investigation, detectives knew that a confession obtained through pressure could become complicated. A voluntary statement that contradicted independent evidence was different. If the suspect told them where he had been, investigators could verify it. If he claimed he had never been near the victim, they could test that. If he claimed he had never touched the paper bag, the fingerprint would become important. But the detectives still held that information back. They wanted him to tell his story without knowing what evidence existed. Finally, the detective asked about the victim. The suspect leaned back. He said he barely knew her. The detective opened an old photograph. Do you recognize her? The suspect looked at it. A few seconds passed. Yes. He admitted knowing her. That was different from his original statement. The detective did not accuse him of lying. He simply asked why. The suspect said he had been afraid of becoming involved. He claimed he had not wanted police attention. The explanation was possible. People sometimes minimize relationships for innocent reasons. But the detectives knew something else. They had already found witnesses who remembered the two had interacted. The question was how often. The suspect said once or twice. The detective asked about another occasion. He denied it. Another question. Another denial. Then the detective mentioned a name. The suspect's expression changed. Only slightly. But the room noticed. The person named had been interviewed years earlier. That witness was no longer certain about everything. But one detail had remained. The suspect had been seen with the victim shortly before the disappearance. The suspect looked down. Then admitted they might have spoken. Might have. The detective wrote it down. 20 years earlier, he had said he had barely known her. Now he was admitting contact. The investigator moved slowly. When was the last time you saw her? The suspect gave a date. Then a time. The detective looked at the old statement. The answer did not match. Not by hours. By days. The suspect tried to explain. He said he had forgotten. The detective nodded. That was exactly what he expected. Then came the question that changed the atmosphere. Did you ever touch anything belonging to her? The suspect frowned. What kind of question was that? The detective repeated it. Anything. A bag. A piece of clothing. A vehicle. Anything at all. The suspect said no. The answer was immediate. Too immediate. The detective did not respond. He reached for another folder. Inside was a photograph. The paper bag. The suspect stared at it. For the first time, the confidence in his face appeared to weaken. He asked what it was. The detective said it had been recovered during the original investigation. The suspect said he had never seen it. The detective placed the photograph on the table. Then another photograph. Then another. The suspect looked at the images. The detectives watched his eyes. He did not touch the photographs. He did not ask what was inside the bag. He did not ask where it had been found. Instead, he asked a different question. Why are you showing me this? The detective leaned forward. Because your fingerprint is on it. Silence. The suspect stared at him. The room seemed to become smaller. He asked what fingerprint. The detective repeated the statement. A fingerprint recovered from the paper bag was consistent with the suspect's reference print. The suspect shook his head. He said it was impossible. The detective asked why. The suspect said he had never touched the bag. The answer had arrived too quickly. The detective asked again, "Have you ever touched that bag?" "No." "Never." "Never." The detective allowed the silence to return. Then he asked the question that had been waiting for 20 years. "If you never touched it, how did your fingerprint get there?" The suspect had no immediate answer. He looked toward the door. Then back at the detective. Maybe someone else used his things. Maybe the fingerprint was wrong. Maybe investigators had contaminated the evidence. Maybe the bag had been handled after the original investigation. All possibilities. All defenses. The detectives expected them. They had prepared for each one. The forensic examiner had already reviewed the chain of custody. The fingerprint had been documented. The evidence container showed no obvious sign of tampering. The print had been recovered from the original material. The reference comparison had been independently examined. But the detectives did not reveal everything. They wanted the suspect to keep talking. He began constructing explanations. He said he might have touched a similar bag years earlier. Perhaps the print came from another object. Perhaps the investigators had mixed up evidence. Perhaps someone had used his belongings. The detective asked one question, then another. Each explanation created a new problem. If the suspect had never seen the bag, why did he suggest that someone might have used his belongings? If he had never touched it, why did he immediately question whether the fingerprint had been contaminated? How did he know the print had been recovered from the bag? The suspect stopped. The detective realized he had made a mistake. A small one, but potentially important. The investigators had told him only that his fingerprint was on the bag. They had not explained how the print had been recovered. They had not told him exactly where on the bag it appeared. Yet the suspect began describing the bag's position. He said the print could have come from the handle. The detective had not said it was on the handle. That detail was not public. The investigator looked at his colleague. A silent exchange. The interview continued. "Where did you think the fingerprint was?" The suspect hesitated. He said he was guessing. The detective asked again. The suspect became defensive. He said the police were trying to trap him. The detective remained calm. No one had mentioned a trap. The suspect had introduced the idea himself. That was entered into the notes. But the fingerprint alone still did not establish the crime. The detectives knew that. They needed context. So they changed direction. They asked about the day of the disappearance. This time, the questions became specific. "Did you drive?" "Yes." "Where?" The suspect named a location. "How long were you there?" "About an hour." "Who saw you?" "A friend." The investigators already knew the friend's name. They had interviewed him. The detective asked whether the friend would confirm the story. The suspect said yes. Then came the next question. "What time did you leave?" The suspect answered. The detective looked at the timeline. That answer created another contradiction. The friend had remembered a different time. The suspect had been given no reason to know that. The detective asked him to repeat the time. He did. Then the detective asked another question. "How did you get there?" The suspect described a route. The route was impossible to reconcile with the travel time. Not impossible in the literal sense, but extremely difficult. He would have had to drive almost continuously. No stops. No delay. No traffic. And the window was already narrow. The detective placed a map on the table. He marked the locations. The suspect stared at it. The investigator traced the route with a pen. Here. Then here. Then here. The suspect watched. The detective asked one question. Could you have made this trip during that time? The suspect said yes. The detective asked how. The suspect gave another explanation. Traffic had been lighter. He knew a shortcut. He could drive quickly. Every answer made the timeline tighter. Then came another problem. The vehicle. The suspect had claimed he was driving directly from one location to another. But investigators had found an old record suggesting his vehicle had been somewhere else. The suspect said the record was wrong. The detective asked whether anyone else had used the vehicle. He said no. That answer mattered. Because now the investigators had something they had not possessed before. A contradiction between the suspect's current statement and independent records. Still no arrest. Not yet. The detective closed the folder. He thanked the suspect for coming in. The suspect stood. For a moment, it looked as though the interview was over. Then the detective asked one final question. Do you know why we reopened this case? The suspect said no. The detective looked at him. Because after 20 years, we found something nobody knew existed. The suspect said nothing. The detective did not explain. He let the sentence remain in the room. The suspect walked out. The door closed. The investigators waited until he was gone. Then they replayed the interview. Not once. Not twice. Again and again. They listened to every hesitation, every correction, every unexpected detail. They compared his answers with the original statement. And slowly, the contradictions began to form a pattern. The story had changed. Not completely. That would have been obvious. It had changed in small places, the exact places where memory should have been strongest. The time. The route. The relationship with the victim. The location of the vehicle. And the paper bag. Especially the paper bag. Because there was one detail the suspect had revealed that could not be explained by ordinary guessing. He knew where investigators believed the fingerprint had been found. The detectives had not told him. The question was no longer simply whether his fingerprint had been left on the bag. The question was whether he knew something about that bag that an innocent person should not have known. The investigators returned to the laboratory. They needed another comparison. Not just the fingerprint. They needed to know whether the trace material found beneath the fold could connect the bag to the location associated with the disappearance. The sample was re-examined. Modern equipment produced a clearer result. The material was consistent with environmental debris from the area. Still circumstantial. Still not a direct identification. But the pieces were beginning to converge. Fingerprint. Timeline. Vehicle. Contradictory statements. Unexpected knowledge. Trace evidence. 5 separate lines. None perfect. Together, increasingly difficult to ignore. Then the forensic examiner noticed something else. The fingerprint on the paper bag was not the only usable print. There was another partial impression. Fainter. Smaller. Partially overlapped by the first. The second print had been almost invisible. Now, with modern enhancement, it could be examined. The examiner enlarged it. A ridge pattern emerged. Different from the first. Someone else had touched the bag. The detectives froze. Because the discovery created a new question. If the first fingerprint belonged to the suspect, whose fingerprint was the second? And more importantly, which person had touched the bag first. The answer could determine whether the suspect had handled the object before or after the disappearance. The investigation had spent years searching for one person. Now the evidence suggested there might be another. A second individual. A second set of hands. A second unknown presence inside a case that had already consumed 20 years. The detectives printed the image. They studied the ridge details. Then they began searching the old case files for every person who might have legitimately handled the bag. But one possibility stood apart from the others. The second fingerprint did not appear to belong to any investigator. It did not match any known handler. And it did not match anyone already eliminated. The cold case had just changed shape. The paper bag was no longer pointing toward a single suspect. It was pointing toward a missing connection. Someone else had touched it. Someone whose identity had never been recorded. And as the investigators stared at the second fingerprint, they realized the most dangerous possibility of all. The person they had spent years trying to find might not have acted alone. The second fingerprint changed the investigation overnight. Until that moment, detectives had been following a single trail. One suspect, one paper bag, one unexplained fingerprint, one increasingly fragile story. Now there were two sets of ridges, two hands, two unknown moments of contact, and potentially two people connected to the same object. The laboratory technician printed the enhanced image again. Then again. Each copy revealed slightly more. The second impression was incomplete. Several ridges had disappeared into the folds of the paper. Others were blurred by age and handling. But there were enough distinctive characteristics to suggest that this was not simply noise. Someone had touched the bag. The question was who? The investigators began with the obvious. They compared the print against every known person who had legitimately handled the evidence. Detectives, evidence technicians, laboratoire personnel, administrative staff, anyone whose fingerprints could reasonably have appeared on the object after collection. The process took time. Some reference records were easy to locate, others were not. The case had been opened and closed more than once over the years. Evidence had been moved. Personnel had changed. Procedures had changed. The detectives had to reconstruct not only the crime, but the life of the evidence itself. That meant going through old evidence logs, the original collection report, storage records, laboratory notes, photographs, transfer forms. Every signature mattered. Every date mattered. Every hand that had touched the evidence had to be accounted for. One by one, the known handlers were eliminated. The second print remained. Unknown. That word carried weight. Unknown did not mean guilty. It meant unfinished. The detectives knew that. They also knew that the print could have been left before the crime, during the crime, or afterward. The timing was everything. So they turned their attention back to the paper bag. The object was examined under magnification. The first fingerprint was located near one portion of the bag. The second was closer to another fold. The positions mattered. If the bag had been held normally, the two prints might have been created at different times. If someone had grabbed it quickly, they could have overlapped. If the bag had been carried by two people, the ridge patterns might have appeared on opposite surfaces. The technicians began reconstructing possible hand positions. Not to tell a story, to test one. The first print could be consistent with someone holding the bag by its folded edge. The second appeared closer to the side panel. The two impressions did not overlap. That meant they could have been created separately. The investigators photographed the bag again. They created a diagram. Two fingerprints. One object. A timeline still missing. Then someone asked a simple question. What had been inside the bag? The original evidence description was incomplete. The contents had not been treated as especially significant. Some items had been removed during the original investigation. Others had been photographed. The detectives searched for the corresponding evidence. One container was found. Another was missing. A third had been transferred to a different storage facility years earlier. The case was becoming a maze. They followed every path. Eventually, they found a photograph showing the contents before the bag was collected. It was not much, but one object stood out. Something associated with the victim. Something that had been seen near her shortly before she disappeared. The detective stared at the image. Then they looked at the bag. If the bag had belonged to the victim, the unknown fingerprint became far more important. They needed to establish ownership. They contacted people who had known her. One person remembered the bag. Another remembered seeing similar bags in her possession. A third person recognized a marking on the side. It was faint in the photograph, but visible. The marking had not been obvious to investigators 20 years earlier. Now digital enhancement made it easier to see. The bag appeared to have come from a business the victim had visited regularly. That did not prove she had carried this particular bag, but it narrowed the possibilities. Investigators contacted the business. Records from 1999 were almost non-existent. The business had changed ownership. The old branding had disappeared. The building had been renovated. But one former employee remembered the packaging. The bags had been used during a specific period. That period overlapped with the disappearance. Another small piece. Another connection. The investigators were careful not to celebrate. Cold cases punish excitement. Every promising clue has a way of becoming meaningless if examined carelessly. So they asked the harder question. Could the suspect have legitimately touched the bag before the disappearance? If he knew the victim, perhaps. If they had met socially, perhaps. If he had helped carry something, perhaps. The fingerprint would still be real. But it would no longer prove criminal involvement. The detectives needed to understand the relationship between the suspect and the victim. They reopened that part of the case. Friends were interviewed again. Old photographs were reviewed. Letters. Messages. Telephone records that had survived. Nothing was definitive. But the relationship appeared more complicated than the suspect had admitted. They had known each other. They had spoken more than once. They had been seen together. There were indications that their relationship had been strained shortly before the disappearance. The investigators looked for motive. Motive was not proof, but it could explain behavior. There had been an argument. The details were unclear. One witness remembered raised voices. Another remembered nothing unusual. The suspect denied any serious disagreement. Again, contradiction. But now the investigators were looking at a larger picture. The victim disappears. The suspect minimizes his relationship with her. His timeline contains unexplained gaps. His vehicle may have been near the relevant area. His fingerprint appears on an object potentially connected to the victim. And now a second unknown fingerprint has been discovered on the same object. The evidence was beginning to resemble a chain. But one link was missing. Who was the second person? The detectives began searching old witness statements for names that had never received serious attention. One name appeared repeatedly. A person who had been interviewed early in the investigation. Not as a suspect. As an acquaintance. The statement was brief. The person claimed not to know much. But when detectives read it again, one sentence stood out. The witness had mentioned seeing someone with the suspect around the time of the disappearance. At the time, the statement had been considered incidental. Now it looked different. The investigators located the witness. It took several attempts. The person had moved away, changed jobs, changed telephone numbers. Eventually, contact was established. The interview began carefully. Do you remember the disappearance? The witness did. Not clearly, but enough. Do you remember the suspect? Yes. Do you remember anyone with him? The witness paused, then gave a name. The detectives looked at each other. It was the name they had seen in the old report, a name that had never become central to the investigation. Someone who had been close enough to the suspect to appear in the same circle. Someone who had not been investigated deeply. The witness was shown an old photograph. The reaction was immediate. Yes. That is him. The investigators asked where the witness had seen the two men. The answer placed them near an area relevant to the disappearance. Not at the exact location, but close enough to matter. When? The witness struggled with the date. The detectives did not pressure them. Instead, they showed calendar references, old events, weather reports, personal records. Slowly, the memory became more specific. The witness remembered the day because something unusual had happened afterward. A conversation, a phone call, a vehicle. The details were fragmented, but one part remained clear. The suspect had not been alone. That changed the direction of the investigation. Detectives searched for the second man's history. He had no obvious connection to the victim, but he had a connection to the primary suspect. The two had known each other for years. They had worked together at one point. They had socialized. They had shared vehicles on occasion. They had remained in contact after the disappearance. That last detail mattered, because the suspect had previously suggested that he barely knew the victim. Now investigators were discovering that his social circle included someone who had potentially been near the case. The second man was located. He was older now. Like the primary suspect, time had changed him. He agreed to speak. The interview started with ordinary questions. Do you remember the victim? Barely. Do you remember the disappearance? Yes. Were you with the primary suspect around that time? No. The answer was immediate. The detectives asked again. No. They asked where he had been. He gave an alibi. It sounded plausible. But the investigators had learned something from the first suspect. Never judge an alibi before testing it. They began verifying. The second man's claimed location was checked against surviving records. Employment records. Telephone records. Old financial transactions. Travel history. One record contradicted a statement. It did not place him at the crime scene, but it showed that he had been somewhere else than he claimed. When confronted, he changed the story. He said he had forgotten. Then he said the record might be wrong. Then he admitted he had made a mistake. The detectives noticed the pattern. It was familiar. Not proof, but familiar. They returned to the fingerprint. Could the second man be the unknown print? A reference sample was needed, but investigators did not yet have enough legal grounds to simply demand one. They needed procedure. They needed patience. They watched. They waited. They examined his routine. They searched for an opportunity to obtain an abandoned object that could provide a legitimate comparison sample. Meanwhile, forensic technicians continued examining the paper bag. They looked at the sequence of contact, the rich detail, the pressure patterns, the direction of the smearing. Could the two prints have been left at different times? Possibly. One print appeared slightly degraded by folding. The other seemed sharper. That suggested something important. The sharper print may have been deposited later. But later did not necessarily mean after the crime. The bag could have been folded and unfolded several times. There was no way to determine timing from the print alone. Still, it was another piece. Then the laboratory discovered a third trace. Not a fingerprint. A microscopic fiber. It had been trapped beneath a crease near the second print. The fiber was blue. The detectives went back to the old photographs. The victim's clothing. The suspect's clothing. The interior of the vehicle. The environment around the location. They began comparing colors and materials. The fiber was too small to identify a specific garment with certainty, but its composition was unusual. It was consistent with a particular synthetic fabric used in clothing and upholstery during that period. The detectives searched the suspect's old photographs. There was a jacket, dark, with a blue interior lining. Could it be the source? Possibly, but photographs could not establish the exact fabric. The jacket itself was long gone. The detectives searched for photographs of the second man. There was another jacket. Similar material. The problem was obvious. Two possibilities. One fiber. No certainty. The case was now moving toward a dangerous intersection. If investigators became convinced that every clue pointed toward the two men, they might stop looking for evidence that contradicted the theory. So they did something uncomfortable. They deliberately tried to destroy their own case. They asked what evidence would prove the fingerprint meant nothing. If the bag had been accessible to the suspect before the disappearance, the print could be innocent. If the second man had also had legitimate access, his print could be innocent. If the fiber came from common clothing, it meant little. If the timeline could be explained, the entire theory weakened. The detectives wrote these possibilities down. Then they attacked each one. Could the suspect explain his relationship with the victim? Could he explain the bag? Could he explain the route? Could the second man explain his presence? Could either man explain the fingerprints? The answers became increasingly complicated. Then came the breakthrough. Not from the laboratory. Not from a witness. From an old piece of paper. A receipt. It had been stored in a separate file. The receipt was dated shortly before the disappearance. The purchase was ordinary, but the location was not. The business was near the place where the victim had last been seen. The name on the receipt was not the victim's. It was the second man's. The amount was small. The item purchased was unremarkable. But the timestamp placed him in the area during a period he had previously denied being there. The detectives stared at the receipt. Then they checked the date. Then the time. Then the witness statement. Then the timeline. The second man's story was no longer merely uncertain. It was contradicted by an independent record. The investigators now had a reason to look more closely at him. They began examining his relationship with the primary suspect. The two had been together around the relevant period. Their stories were different. Their timelines overlapped. And one of their fingerprints was potentially on the paper bag. The detectives requested another forensic comparison. This time, they knew exactly what they were looking for. The unknown print. The reference sample. The laboratory began the examination. Hours passed. The rich details were compared. One characteristic. Then another. Then another. The examiner stopped. He looked at the image. Then at the reference sample. He continued. The comparison was not complete, but the similarities were becoming difficult to ignore. The second fingerprint might belong to the second man. If confirmed, the investigation would have crossed a line. Two people. One object. One disappearance. 20 years of silence. The detectives waited for the final conclusion. Then the phone rang. The laboratory had an answer. The second fingerprint was consistent with the second man's reference sample. The investigators did not celebrate. They simply looked at the case board. Two fingerprints. Two men. One victim. And suddenly, a question that had seemed impossible 20 years earlier became unavoidable. What if the disappearance had never been a one-person crime? What if the paper bag was not just evidence of contact? What if it was evidence of coordination? The detectives went back to the timeline one final time. They placed both men on the board. They marked their known movements. Then they marked the victim's last confirmed movements. For the first time, the lines crossed. Not once. Twice. And at the center of those crossing lines was the same narrow window. The same period in which the victim vanished. The same period the two men had spent years explaining away. The investigation was no longer chasing a single fingerprint. It was reconstructing a sequence. And if that sequence could be proven, the 20-year-old cold case might finally become something else. A prosecutable case. But before investigators could move forward, they needed to answer one final question. Why? Why would two men risk everything? Why the victim? Why that day? And why had both of them remained silent for 20 years? The detectives knew the fingerprints could tell them who had touched the bag. The timeline could tell them where they had been. The records could expose their contradictions. But only motive could begin to explain what had happened. And somewhere in the past, buried beneath 20 years of ordinary life, there was a reason. The investigators just had to find it. The question of motive was always the most dangerous question in an investigation. Evidence could show contact. Records could show movement. Fingerprints could place a hand on an object. But motive tried to explain why. And why was where investigators could easily lose themselves. A detective could look at a suspicious relationship and imagine resentment. Look at a financial problem and imagine desperation. Look at an argument and imagine revenge. The danger was obvious. A motive could be invented after the fact. The investigators needed one that existed before the crime. Something real. Something documented. Something that could explain why two men might have crossed a line from ordinary life into something irreversible. They began with the victim, not the suspects. That was deliberate. The victim's life had to be understood on its own terms. Who was she? Who did she trust? Who had access to her? Who knew her routine? Who had reason to fear her? Who had reason to want something from her? The old files contained fragments. Friends remembered different sides of her personality. Some described her as cautious. Others described her as independent. There were ordinary disagreements. Ordinary friendships. Ordinary problems. Nothing immediately suggested a target. That was important. The investigators were not looking for a perfect victim. There was no such thing. They were looking for a connection. Something linking her to the two men. The first suspect had already admitted knowing her more closely than he had originally claimed. The second man was harder to place. He insisted he had barely interacted with her. But the detectives discovered something buried inside an old interview. A witness had once mentioned seeing the second man near a place the victim frequented. The statement had been overlooked. The witness was interviewed again. This time, the detective asked a different question. Did you ever see him speak to her? The witness hesitated, then nodded. Yes. The meeting had been brief, but it had happened. The detective asked when. The witness gave an approximate date. It was close to the disappearance. Too close to ignore. Why were they talking? The witness did not know. What did they look like? The witness remembered the victim appeared uncomfortable. That detail was subjective. It could not be treated as fact. But it was enough to create another line of inquiry. Investigators began searching for any documented interaction between the victim and the second man. They found a reference in an old phone record. The record was incomplete. The number had changed hands. But the call existed. Short. Only a few minutes. The date was important. The call occurred shortly before the disappearance. The detectives stared at the record. The second man had denied knowing her. Yet there had been contact. Again, not proof. But another contradiction. The detectives asked why the call had never been mentioned. The second man said he had forgotten. The same explanation. Again, forgotten. The investigators were beginning to notice how often that word appeared in the case. People forgot. Witnesses forgot. Suspects forgot. Records remembered. Paper remembered. Fingerprints remembered. And the more investigators compared the surviving evidence with human memory, the more unreliable the human stories became. They dug deeper into the victim's financial life. Not because money automatically created motive, because financial pressure could explain relationships. There was an account, a payment, a dispute. Nothing enormous, but enough to suggest someone had been expecting money or access to something. The investigators followed the trail. The transaction involved someone connected indirectly to the first suspect. That connection had not been obvious in 1999. Now it was a business relationship, a debt, a disagreement. The detectives mapped it. Victim. First suspect. Second suspect. Financial connection. The lines were beginning to converge. But then they discovered something that complicated the theory. The victim had apparently been considering leaving a situation, a relationship, a job, an arrangement. The exact details were unclear, but several people remembered that she had been worried. Not necessarily about the two men, about something else. That mattered. Perhaps the crime had nothing to do with money. Perhaps the suspects were not motivated by revenge. Perhaps the victim had simply encountered the wrong people at the wrong time. The detectives refused to decide too early. They searched for everything. They examined old correspondence. They reviewed photographs. They searched for notes. They looked at every surviving piece of communication from the weeks before the disappearance. Then they found a name neither suspect had mentioned. Someone who had been in contact with the victim shortly before she vanished. This person was not part of the original suspect list. That immediately raised the stakes. Investigators located him. He agreed to speak. At first, his story seemed ordinary. He knew the victim. They had spoken. There had been no conflict. He had no idea what happened. But then he mentioned something he could not have known from the public reports. He knew about the paper bag. The detective stopped writing. How do you know about that? The man looked confused. He said someone had told him. Who? He gave a name. The first suspect. The room went quiet. The paper bag had never been publicly identified as important. At least not in detail. Yet the first suspect had apparently discussed it. That meant the suspect knew more about the evidence than he had admitted. The detectives went back to the original interviews. The first suspect had been questioned about objects found near the disappearance. He had denied knowing anything. Now there was a witness claiming he had discussed the bag. The investigators interviewed the witness again. This time they pressed for exact wording. What did he say? The witness tried to remember. He could not reproduce every sentence, but the general meaning remained. The first suspect had referred to a bag connected to the victim, a bag investigators had not publicly described. That was significant. Still, the detectives knew that memory could be contaminated. The witness could have learned the detail later. Rumors could have circulated. So they asked another question. When did he first hear about the bag? The answer came quickly, before the case became widely discussed, before the evidence had been described publicly. That narrowed the possibilities. The detectives began searching for another witness who could confirm the conversation. They found one. The second witness remembered something similar. Not the exact words, but the subject. The first suspect had talked about an object associated with the victim. The two witnesses had no obvious reason to coordinate their stories. That made the information more useful. The detectives now had a new question. Why would the suspect talk about the bag? Perhaps he had touched it innocently. Perhaps he had seen it during a normal interaction. Perhaps someone had told him. Or perhaps he had been there. The investigation turned toward the second man. If he was involved, did he know about the bag? Investigators searched his history. They discovered that he and the first suspect had remained connected after the disappearance. They had worked together. They had traveled together. They had even shared expenses. Nothing criminal by itself. But the relationship was deeper than either man had originally admitted. The detectives interviewed the second man again. This time they asked about the first suspect. How often did you see him? Regularly. Did you discuss the disappearance? No. Did he ever talk about the victim? No. Did he ever mention a bag? No. The detective placed a photograph on the table. The second man looked at it. He said he did not recognize it. The detective asked whether he had ever been near the victim's belongings. No. Then came the fingerprint. Not the full laboratory report. Just the fact that a fingerprint consistent with his had been recovered. The second man became silent. He asked whether the print was certain. The detective said the forensic comparison had been independently reviewed. The man leaned back. Then he asked whether the first suspect had also been identified. That question mattered. The investigators had not told him that. Not yet. The second man had somehow connected the two. The detective asked why. He said he was simply guessing. But the interview had changed. His confidence was gone. He asked for a lawyer. The interview ended. Outside the room, the detective stood silently. The second man had not confessed. But his reaction had created another question. How did he know investigators were connecting him to the first suspect? The case was becoming increasingly strange. Two men. Two fingerprints. A victim. A paper bag. A hidden conversation. And a shared history. The investigators now needed to establish whether the two suspects had communicated about the disappearance after the crime. They searched old telephone records. Most were gone. But some had survived. There were calls. Short calls. Long calls. Calls late at night. Calls immediately after investigators had contacted one of them. The pattern was suggestive. But patterns can deceive. The detectives needed content. That was almost impossible after 20 years. Then a forgotten source appeared. A former employee at a telecommunications company had retained archived billing records for a limited period. Not recordings. Just metadata. Numbers. Dates. Times. Durations. It was enough to establish contact. The records showed something investigators had not expected. The two men had spoken repeatedly during the first week after the disappearance. Some calls lasted only seconds. Others lasted much longer. One occurred late at night. Another occurred shortly after a major development in the search. The investigators compared the call times with the case timeline. A pattern emerged. When investigators discovered something, the men sometimes spoke. When a search was announced, they spoke. When public attention increased, they spoke. The connection was circumstantial, but it was difficult to dismiss. The detectives searched for more. They examined travel. One of the men had made an unexplained trip shortly after the disappearance. The destination was not far away. The trip itself was not suspicious, but the route intersected an area that had never been fully searched. The detectives returned to the map. There it was. A road. A secondary route. A location that had barely appeared in the original investigation. The reason was simple. In 1999, investigators had not known to look there. Now they did. The search team went out. The area had changed dramatically. Trees had grown. Buildings had been renovated. Roads had been widened. Some landmarks were gone. But investigators worked from old maps and photographs. They reconstructed the landscape. They searched drainage areas, abandoned structures, wooded sections, places where an object could remain hidden for years. Nothing. Then, near the edge of an old property, a search technician found something. Not human remains. Not clothing. A piece of material. Old. Weathered. Partially buried. The team stopped. The object was photographed before being moved. It was packaged. Sent to the laboratory. The investigators waited. The material turned out to be consistent with an ordinary manufactured product. Nothing definitive. Another dead end. The cold case seemed to resist every attempt to solve it. But the search had produced something else. A photograph. A structure visible in the background of an old image. The structure had not been noticed in 1999. Now, when investigators compared the photograph with historical maps, they realized it stood along the route associated with the suspect's unexplained trip. That was enough to justify another search. The investigators returned. This time, they searched more systematically. And inside an abandoned outbuilding, they found a small metal object. Rust. Dirt. Age. No obvious connection. It was collected anyway. Back at the laboratory, the object was cleaned carefully. Under the corrosion, a partial marking became visible. A manufacturer's code. The detectives traced it. The object had been part of equipment commonly used in a vehicle during the late 1990s. That did not solve the case. But the suspect had owned a vehicle of the same general type. Again, possibility. Again, uncertainty. The investigators were assembling a case from fragments. But they needed something that could connect the suspects to the victim beyond circumstantial evidence. The paper bag remained the strongest physical link. And then the laboratory returned to it. The second fingerprint was re-examined. The examiner discovered something important. The print had not been deposited on a clean section of paper. It appeared partially over another disturbance in the fibers. That suggested the bag had been handled more than once. One person had touched it, then another. The order could not be established with certainty, but the contact pattern was consistent with two separate handling events. The detectives looked at the timeline. If the first suspect had touched the bag before the second suspect, it could support one sequence. If the second had touched it first, another sequence became possible. The evidence could not tell them which. Yet the existence of two prints was itself powerful. Two people had touched an object that appeared connected to the victim. Two people who had lied about their relationship to the case. Two people whose timelines contained unexplained gaps. The investigators now faced the central challenge. Could they prove coordination? They needed communication. They needed movement. They needed motive. They needed physical evidence. They had fragments of all four. But fragments were not enough. The detectives began working backward from the day of the disappearance. What had happened immediately before? The victim had been seen. Then she had vanished. What happened immediately after? The suspects had communicated. Then their stories diverged. What happened years later? They continued to deny knowledge. What happened when the fingerprint was discovered? Both became defensive. The pattern was disturbing. But the investigators wanted more. They returned to the victim's last known movements. A witness had remembered something else. A vehicle. Not the same description from the original investigation. This time, the witness recalled a distinctive feature. A damaged rear light. A small imperfection. A detail that had seemed irrelevant 20 years earlier. The detectives searched old photographs of the suspect's vehicle. There it was. A damaged rear light. The witness could not provide absolute certainty. But the similarity was striking. The vehicle had been repaired later. The repair record existed. And the repair date was shortly after the disappearance. The detectives now had a new hypothesis. Perhaps the vehicle had been damaged during an encounter. Perhaps not. They could not assume. They needed evidence. They searched for photographs from the period. They found one. The vehicle appeared in the background of an old photograph taken by someone who had no connection to the case. The rear light was visibly damaged. The date of the photograph was established independently. It was within the relevant period. The detective stared at the image. A vehicle. A damaged light. A witness memory. A repair record. None was conclusive. Together, they created pressure. The first suspect was brought in again. This time, the detectives did not begin with the fingerprint. They asked about the vehicle. He said he had never damaged it. The detective showed him the photograph. He stared, then admitted there had been a minor accident. When? He gave a date. The date did not match the repair record. The detective asked why. He said he did not remember. Again. That word. The investigator closed the folder, then asked one final question. Did the second man ever ride in that vehicle? The suspect hesitated, then said yes. Only occasionally. The detectives had their next contradiction. The second man had denied ever being inside the vehicle during the relevant period. Now the first suspect was saying otherwise. The investigators returned to the second man. They asked the same question. He denied it. The detectives told him that another person had placed him in the vehicle. He became angry, then defensive, then silent. Finally, he said he might have been there. The detectives asked when. He could not say. They asked why. He did not answer. The interview ended. The two men were now giving conflicting accounts about the same vehicle. And the vehicle had become increasingly important. Because if the victim had been inside it, the fingerprints and the timeline could suddenly become part of one sequence. The investigators searched the old vehicle records again. A maintenance shop had preserved photographs from the original repair. The vehicle had damage along one side. The photographs showed something else. A small tear in the interior upholstery. The detectives compared the fabric. Blue synthetic fibers. The same general composition as the microscopic fiber recovered from the paper bag. The laboratory could not say with absolute certainty that the fiber came from that vehicle. But the similarities were enough to justify additional testing. A sample was taken from preserved material associated with the old vehicle. The forensic examiner compared the fibers. This time, the result was stronger. The characteristics were consistent. Still not an absolute identification. But the probability of a random match was lower. The detectives now had a possible physical bridge between the bag and the vehicle. And the vehicle connected the two suspects. The case board became crowded. Fingerprints. Fiber. Vehicle. receipt, phone records, contradictory statements, witness memories, a hidden relationship, a suspicious timeline, 20 years of silence. The investigators stood before the board. They had more evidence than ever. Yet they still did not have the one thing they wanted most: a direct explanation. They needed one of the men to break. Not necessarily confess. Just explain. Explain the bag. Explain the vehicle. Explain the fingerprints. Explain the phone calls. Explain the lies. The detectives knew that if they confronted the suspects with everything at once, the men could retreat behind lawyers in silence. So they chose a different strategy. They would separate the evidence. They would allow each man to believe the other might already be talking. They would reveal just enough to create uncertainty. The first suspect was contacted again. The second suspect was contacted separately. Neither knew exactly what investigators had. That uncertainty was deliberate. And then, for the first time in 20 years, one of the men made a mistake that could not be explained away as a bad memory. During a recorded conversation, he referred to a place investigators had never mentioned, a place connected to the old route, a place where the victim might have been taken. The detectives listened to the recording once, then again. The location was unmistakable. The man had just placed himself inside a part of the investigation that had never been made public. The case changed again, because now investigators had something far more valuable than suspicion. They had knowledge. And the question became terrifyingly simple. How could he know about that place? The detectives pulled the old maps. They marked the location. Then they marked the route. Then they marked the paper bag. The lines converged. But the final connection was still missing. What had happened inside that place? What had happened to the victim? And if the two men had truly been involved, why had neither of them ever told the same story? The answer was hidden somewhere between the fingerprints and the missing years. And the investigators were now closer than they had ever been. Not because someone had confessed. Not because a witness had suddenly remembered everything. But because the past had begun contradicting itself. And once a lie begins to crack, it does not always collapse slowly. Sometimes it breaks all at once. The location was only a name. A few words spoken during a recorded conversation. Nothing more. But to the investigators, those words sounded like a door opening. They had spent years looking at maps without knowing where to draw the final line. Now the suspect had drawn it for them. The detectives listened to the recording again. They isolated the sentence. They slowed it down. They listened for hesitation. There was none. The suspect had spoken naturally. That was what made it disturbing. He had not been asked about the location. He had not been shown a map. The investigators had never mentioned it. Yet he knew it. The question was no longer whether the location mattered. The question was how he knew about it. The detectives began with the simplest explanation. Perhaps the location had been publicly discussed. Perhaps it appeared in an old newspaper article. Perhaps someone had mentioned it during the original investigation. Perhaps the suspect had learned about it through someone else. Before treating the statement as incriminating, investigators checked every possibility. They searched newspaper archives. They reviewed television reports. They examined public records. They looked through old interviews. Nothing. The location had barely appeared anywhere. In fact, most people outside the investigation had no reason to know it existed. That eliminated one explanation. The detectives then checked whether the suspect had any legitimate reason to have visited the area. Employment. Family. Friends. Property. Recreation. Anything. There was one connection. A weak one. The suspect had once known someone who lived nearby. But that relationship had ended years before the disappearance. Could he have learned the location from that person? Possibly. The investigators found the individual. The person denied ever discussing the victim or the investigation with the suspect. That did not prove anything. But another path closed. The detectives returned to the second suspect. They asked whether he knew the location. He denied it. They asked whether he had ever been there. He said no. The detectives showed him a map. He looked at it, then looked away. The reaction was subtle, but it was different from the first interview. The detective asked again, "Have you ever been there?" The man hesitated. He finally admitted that he had passed through the area years earlier. When? He could not remember. Why? He could not remember that either. The detectives had heard enough. They did not push. Instead, they asked a different question. Did the first suspect ever take you there? The answer was no. The detective waited, then asked again. The second suspect changed his wording. Not that he remembered. Not that he knew. Just that he did not think so. The distinction mattered. The detectives ended the interview. Then they returned to the location. The area looked different from 1999. Trees had grown. A road had been widened. A building had been demolished. Another structure stood where an empty lot had once been. But beneath those changes, the geography remained. The investigators used historical maps. They overlaid modern satellite imagery with older survey data. They identified the roads that had existed in 1999. They reconstructed possible routes. Then they asked the most important question. If someone wanted to move a person without being noticed, could this area have been used? The answer was yes. There were stretches of road with little traffic. There were blind turns. There were wooded sections. There were abandoned structures. But investigators were careful. A secluded place was not automatically a crime scene. They needed evidence that someone connected to the case had actually been there. The first search produced nothing. The second produced little. Then a technician noticed a depression in the soil near the remains of an old structure. The area was photographed. Ground conditions were documented. A search team examined the location systematically. No remains. No clothing. No obvious weapon. Nothing that could immediately connect the site to the victim. But near the structure, they found an old piece of hardware. Rust-covered. Partially buried. The item was photographed and collected. It was not enough. The detectives almost dismissed it. Then the laboratory examined the object. The material showed traces of paint, a specific industrial coating. The investigators compared it with the paint found on the old vehicle associated with the primary suspect. The results were not definitive, but there was a similarity. The same general coating system. The same approximate color. The same period of manufacture. Again, the case produced a clue that was suggestive without being conclusive. The detectives knew the difference. They had learned not to confuse consistent with identified as. Every forensic result had limits. The question was whether the limits mattered when multiple independent clues pointed toward the same sequence. The investigation continued. They searched the surrounding area. Several meters from the old structure, a technician discovered something else. A fragment of fabric, almost completely deteriorated. The team stopped. The object was documented before collection. The fabric was placed in sterile packaging. At the laboratory, technicians compared its composition with known materials connected to the victim. The result was inconclusive. The fragment was too damaged. But microscopic examination revealed a pattern. The weave was unusual. The investigators searched photographs of the victim's clothing. One garment had a similar weave. That was not enough to identify the fragment, but it justified another search. They contacted the victim's family. Old clothing had been preserved. Not much, but enough for comparison. A garment from the same period was located. Samples were taken. The laboratory compared the fibers. The characteristics were similar. Not an absolute match, but close enough that investigators could no longer dismiss the possibility. The location might have been connected to the victim. The detectives returned to the suspect's recorded statement. Why had he mentioned it? That question became more important than the physical evidence itself. They played the recording for a forensic interview specialist. The specialist listened carefully. The sentence was examined for context. The suspect had been talking about another subject. The location appeared almost accidentally. There was no reason for him to introduce it, unless he already knew it mattered. That did not prove guilt, but it suggested knowledge. And knowledge had become the central issue. The detectives began looking for every possible way the suspect could have known about the location. The results were unsettling. There were no obvious public sources, no clear legitimate reason, no witness who had told him, no record placing him there innocently. The only surviving connection was the second suspect. The two men had been together around the relevant period. Their phone records showed contact. Their statements contradicted one another. Their fingerprints were on the same paper bag. Now one of them knew a location the other had denied visiting. The investigators began wondering whether the two men had discussed the case among themselves. If so, when? The phone records could show communication. They could not reveal what had been said, but the pattern of calls was enough to justify deeper scrutiny. There was one period in particular. The first week after the disappearance. The men had spoken repeatedly. Then their communication suddenly dropped. The detectives wondered why. Was it coincidence? Did they become afraid? Had investigators made contact with one of them? Old police records answered part of the question. A detective had interviewed the first suspect during that period. The second suspect had been interviewed shortly afterward. The calls between them increased around those interviews. The pattern was striking. Police contact. Telephone calls. More police contact. More calls. Then silence. The investigators reconstructed the sequence. It looked like two people monitoring the investigation. But again, appearances were not proof. They needed something direct. They searched for letters, messages, old notes, anything that might have survived. One document surfaced. A handwritten note discovered among old personal papers belonging to the second suspect. It was undated. The handwriting was his. The message was short. No names. No direct confession. But one phrase appeared. Keep the story the same. The investigators stared at it. The phrase could mean anything. A personal argument. A business dispute. An unrelated problem. Without context, it was worthless. The detectives needed to know when it had been written. Forensic handwriting analysis could establish whether the note had been written by the suspect. That part was relatively straightforward. But dating the paper was much harder. The paper itself was old. The ink was compatible with the period. But that did not establish an exact date. The note could have been written years earlier or later. The investigators did not treat it as a confession. They treated it as a lead. They searched the second suspect's history for situations in which two people might have needed to keep a story consistent. Nothing obvious. Then they found a name. The first suspect. The two men had shared an explanation for another incident years earlier. It had nothing to do with the disappearance. But it established something important. They had a history of coordinating stories. The detectives interviewed the first suspect again. This time, they asked about the note. He denied knowing about it. Had he ever told the second man to keep a story the same? No. Had they ever discussed giving investigators identical accounts? No. The detective showed him the handwriting. The suspect stared at it, then said he could not identify it. The detective asked whether the phrase sounded familiar. No. Then came a different question. Did you and the second man ever discuss what you would tell police? The suspect answered too quickly. No. The detective asked why he was so certain. The suspect said because there was nothing to discuss. The detective made a note. Nothing to discuss. That phrase mattered, because the investigators had not told him the note concerned the disappearance. He had connected the question to the case immediately. Another piece. Another unexplained reaction. But still no confession. The detectives were approaching the limits of circumstantial evidence. They needed to establish what happened to the victim. The location search became more extensive. Forensic specialists examined the soil. Ground-penetrating technology was used in areas where the terrain had not changed dramatically. Nothing definitive appeared. A search dog was brought through the area. The dog alerted near the remains of the old structure. Investigators searched again. They found disturbed soil. But the disturbance was old. It could have been caused by roots, animals, construction, weather. The site had changed too much over 20 years. The team continued. Then, beneath a layer of soil near a concrete foundation, they found a small metal clasp. The object was badly corroded. It was photographed, recovered, packaged. The detectives compared it with photographs of items the victim had owned. One item stood out. A piece of personal property with a similar clasp. The match was not perfect. The object had deteriorated too much. But the dimensions were close. The investigators contacted the family again. A photograph was located. The victim had been wearing an item that used a clasp of the same general type. The evidence could not establish identity. But now the location was producing multiple artifacts that appeared potentially connected. The investigators expanded the search. Nothing else. No body. No definitive clothing. No weapon. No direct physical evidence proving what happened. The absence remained. And that absence was devastating. Without a body, prosecutors faced another challenge. The victim had disappeared. Evidence suggested violence. Evidence suggested concealment. But the exact sequence remained uncertain. The investigators needed to reconstruct it. They turned to the paper bag again. Why had it been there? What was inside? Who touched it? The first fingerprint. The second fingerprint. The fiber. The trace material. The investigators began constructing a hypothetical sequence. The victim had the bag. The first suspect handled it. The second suspect handled it. The bag traveled. The bag was left behind. But when? Before the disappearance? During? After? The forensic evidence could not answer all of those questions. The detectives knew that. They needed testimony. Someone had to explain the missing hours. They searched again for witnesses. One person came forward unexpectedly. A former acquaintance who had never spoken to police during the original investigation. The person had been afraid. Afraid of becoming involved. Afraid of being wrong. Afraid of the two men. The detective asked why. The witness explained. Years earlier, the witness had seen something. A vehicle. Two men. And a person who appeared to be struggling. The memory was not perfect. But one detail remained. The witness remembered the sound of a door slamming, then a vehicle leaving. The witness had never reported it because they had not understood what they were seeing. Now, 20 years later, the witness understood. The detectives asked when it happened. The answer placed it inside the critical window. They asked whether the witness could identify the men. One was uncertain. The other was more familiar. The primary suspect. The detectives showed photographs carefully. The witness did not immediately identify him. Then one photograph appeared. The witness pointed. "I think that's him." Not certainty, but enough to investigate. The detectives asked about the second man. The witness hesitated, then identified him as someone who had been nearby. The investigation had now reached a critical point. For the first time, there was a witness placing both men near a vehicle during the relevant period. The fingerprint evidence connected both men to the paper bag. The vehicle evidence connected one of them to a damaged vehicle. The phone records connected the two men after the disappearance. The location statement connected one man to a place investigators had never publicly emphasized. And the old note suggested coordinated storytelling. The case was becoming stronger, but it was also becoming more complicated, because one question remained unanswered. Where was the victim? The detectives could not bring the family an arrest and call it justice. They needed to know what had happened. They returned to the second suspect. This time, the interview was different. He knew investigators had found something. He knew the case had changed. The detective placed a photograph on the table. The old location. The paper bag. The fingerprint. The witness statement. One by one. The suspect looked at them. He did not deny everything. That was the first major change. Instead, he said he had been there. The detective asked where. He gave the location. The same location. The one he had previously denied knowing. The room went silent. The detective asked why he had lied. The suspect said he was afraid. Afraid of what? He did not answer. The detective asked whether the victim had been there. The suspect looked down, then said something that changed the entire investigation. He said he had seen her. Not harmed her. Not kidnapped her. Just seen her. The detective asked when. The suspect gave a date. The date was wrong. The detective corrected him. The suspect looked up, then realized the mistake. He had just admitted knowledge of an event he had previously denied. The interview continued. Slowly. Carefully. The suspect began describing the location. The road. The structure. The vehicle. Details that had never been released publicly. The detectives listened without interrupting. Then came the question they had been waiting 20 years to ask. Where did she go? The suspect closed his eyes. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he opened them and gave an answer that investigators had never heard before. He said the first suspect knew. The detective asked what that meant. The second man shook his head. He said he could not explain. But the implication was clear. The two men were no longer simply connected by fingerprints. They were connected by knowledge. And somewhere between them was the missing truth. The investigators ended the interview. Outside, the case team gathered. They now had a potential admission that placed the second suspect at the location. They had physical evidence. They had witness testimony. They had contradictions. They had a possible motive, but still no final answer. Because the second suspect had refused to say what happened after the victim was brought there. He had stopped just before the most important part. And that silence was deliberate. The detectives knew it. The prosecutor knew it. The family knew nothing yet. The investigators returned to the old maps. They looked beyond the structure. beyond the road, beyond the search area. If the victim had been taken from the location, there had to be another route, another place, another vehicle, another decision. The second suspect had given them only one piece of the journey. The rest remained hidden. Then investigators noticed something on the original map, a road that had never been searched. It led away from the location, away from the populated area, toward a stretch of land that had been inaccessible in 1999. The road was almost forgotten, but it had existed. And if the suspects had used it, they could have disappeared from view within minutes. The detectives marked it, then marked the old vehicle route. The lines connected. The next search would follow that road, not because they knew what they would find, because after 20 years, they finally knew where to look. And as the team prepared to return to the field, one fact remained impossible to ignore. The paper bag had survived. The fingerprints had survived. The contradictions had survived. The lies had survived. And somewhere beyond that forgotten road, the final evidence might still be waiting.